The air above Oakhaven was thick and still, tasting perpetually of sun-baked pine needles and the faint metallic tang of decay that clung to every failing structure in the valley. The sky, even at midday, possessed a heavy, muted quality, a reflection of the dust motes suspended high above the exhausted landscape. Elijah was 14, an age that demanded constant forward motion, yet his life was defined by perpetual stagnation. His boots, too large and worn thin at the soles, scuffed against the gravel path leading toward the ridge, known locally as the Whispering Scarp. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was merely fleeing the crushing, predictable silence of the temporary residence where he was currently placed. A silence punctuated only by the shallow, judgmental breathing of the caretaker, Mrs. Hemlock. He had walked this overgrown path countless times, drawn by the isolation and the promise of a place where he didn't have to exist in relation to anyone else. Today, however, the familiar path felt subtly wrong. The soil beneath a dense cluster of aged rhododendrons, a patch he usually sidestepped due to its relentless shade, seemed unnaturally compacted. It wasn't the yielding earth he knew. It was flat, too level, refusing to absorb the rainwater that must have saturated the area weeks ago. Elijah stopped, tilting his head. He lowered himself onto his knees, ignoring the sharp, dry needles that pierced the worn fabric of his trousers. The ground here was covered by a thick mat of decades-old leaf litter, interwoven with the tenacious, fine roots of the rhododendrons. He began to scrape the debris away, his fingers, stiff and cold despite the warm sun filtering through the canopy, working meticulously. The initial scrape revealed nothing but damp, dark soil. He dug deeper, moving the moist, clotted material aside, the smell of fermentation and rich, dark humus filling his nostrils. Then his fingertip met resistance. It was hard, unyielding, and possessed a slick, unnatural smoothness. He increased his effort, using the edge of a broken slate rock he found nearby as a crude trowel. The soil came away in heavy, wet clumps, and a geometric pattern began to emerge. Not the random scatter of rock and root he expected, but a perfect 90-degree corner etched in cold, dark metal. Elijah felt a sudden, profound lurch in his stomach, a dizzying mix of fear and exhilarating disbelief. This was not a natural occurrence. The metal was heavy gauge, thick, and stained a deep, rusted ochre where the moisture had penetrated. He cleared the area further, revealing a perfectly rectangular plate, perhaps 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, embedded flush with the bedrock. It was a hatch cover. He spent the next hour working, sweat gluing the collar of his threadbare shirt to the back of his neck. His hands ached, the fine grit embedding itself painfully under his fingernails. When the entire plate was exposed, it was clear that it was designed not to be found. The seam where the metal met the earth was almost invisible, sealed by a heavy, petrified gasket that had long since become brittle. Near the center of the long edge, protected by a flange of thick, overlapping metal, he found the mechanism. It was a handle, recessed and stiff, coated in layers of grime and ancient, flaking paint. It required both hands, pressed flat against the cold steel, and the full leverage of his thin frame. He took a deep breath, held it, and pulled. The first movement was agonizingly slow, accompanied by a shriek of tortured, frozen metal that echoed sharply off the distant cliffs. The sound was immense, an unnatural noise ripping through the pastoral silence, loud enough to bring the crows from the upper branches in a panicked flurry of black wings and panicked cries. Elijah fell backward onto the pine needles as the mechanism began to release. A series of deep, grinding thunks followed, like the slow, protesting turns of enormous submerged gears. The air around the hatch cover suddenly shifted, and a plume of cold subterranean air, smelling overwhelmingly of ozone, mineral dust, and deep, profound age, rushed out and enveloped him. He scrambled back to the edge of the opening, peering down into the darkness. The hatch, now slightly ajar, revealed a yawning void. The cold air pouring out felt strangely sterile, possessing a dryness that suggested it had been recycled and filtered thousands of times. He needed light. His inventory was meager: a half-eaten granola bar, a tarnished silver coin he kept for luck, and a small, cheap plastic flashlight he'd salvaged from a junk drawer. He pulled the flashlight out. The beam was weak and yellow, barely piercing the gloom, but it was enough to see the first descent. Below the hatch cover lay a narrow metal staircase, reinforced steel grating, spiraling tightly downward. Moisture had beaded on the upper steps, condensation forming where the cold interior air met the warmer surface air. The structure looked solid, immovable, engineered for permanence. Elijah hesitated, the profound sense of trespass heavy on his shoulders. This wasn't merely an abandoned well or a collapsed root cellar. This was intentional. This was sealed. His life thus far had been a series of open doors leading to temporary rooms. The prospect of an unknown, sealed space, a place that held its secrets tight, was an irresistible gravitational pull. He swung his legs over the lip of the opening, carefully placing his weight on the topmost grating. The steel was frigid through the thin soles of his boots. The sound of his descent was hollow and resonant. Each step on the grating sent a metallic ring through the shaft. Amplified by the confined space, the air grew progressively colder, heavier, denser, muffling the sounds from the world above. After perhaps 20 feet, the light from the forest floor was entirely extinguished. He was wrapped in a suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the struggling beam of his flashlight. The spiral seemed endless. He counted his steps, a nervous habit, reaching over 150 before his foot met solid concrete, not grating. He stood on a small, sterile landing. The flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing thick, seamless, poured concrete, smooth and unblemished, protected by a thin layer of fine white dust. There was an arched doorway directly ahead, sealed by an inner steel security door, thicker and more robust than the hatch above. This inner door was equipped with a large industrial-grade manual wheel. He placed his hands on the cold metal spokes. They were massive, intended for effortless turning by a strong adult. He braced his feet and pushed. The wheel refused to budge. It was locked, secured by pneumatic or mechanical bolts that had been dormant for decades. Elijah pushed again, putting his shoulder into the effort, his breath catching in his chest. Nothing. He slumped against the cold concrete wall, his initial exhilaration draining away, replaced by the bitter, familiar taste of defeat. He had found the secret, only to be stopped by the final, unyielding lock. He ran his hands over the smooth, cold surface of the steel door, searching for any weakness, any seam. His fingers brushed against a small, recessed panel next to the doorframe, approximately waist height. It was made of dull, brushed aluminum, featuring a small, square screen, dark and inert, and a numeric keypad. He held the weak beam of the flashlight closer to the screen. It was covered in a fine layer of dust, but beneath the grime he saw a faint inscription. A.D.A.M. System Access. Elijah ran his thumb across the dust, cleaning the glass. He pressed a button on the keypad. It made a faint, satisfying click, a sound of latent circuitry awakening. Immediately, the square screen flared to life, casting a sickly, persistent green glow onto the concrete wall. The light was harsh, demanding, banishing the gentle yellow beam of his flashlight into irrelevance. The text that appeared was blocky, precise, and entirely impersonal. A.D.A.M. System Online. Standby mode. Please input authorized access code. Elijah stared, his heart hammering against his ribs, audible in the deep silence of the shaft. He felt a desperate, childish urge to input a simple sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, but he knew that was futile. He pressed the clear button. The system responded instantly. The access code required for environmental seal release, structural integrity nominal, atmospheric filtration 99%, external radiation shielding at optimal levels. The term radiation shielding sent a cold, clinical shock of terror through him. This was not merely a secret hideout. He needed a code. He searched the surrounding concrete walls again, running his hands along every inch of the smooth, cold surface, hoping for an etching, a scrap of paper, any indication. There was nothing. The engineering was too clean, too thorough. He returned to the panel, his eyes fixed on the green display. He noticed a minute, almost imperceptible detail near the bottom edge of the aluminum panel. A small, circular indentation, perhaps the size of a thumbprint, completely covered in dust. He brushed the dust away. Beneath it, the surface was slightly discolored, an oily residue remaining. He recognized the smudge pattern, the size and shape of a human fingertip. Driven by pure, instinctive desperation, Elijah pressed his own thumb firmly onto the circular indentation. The machine paused. The green text wavered slightly, then exploded into a cascade of red and yellow alarms. Unrecognized biometric signature, access denied, warning, non-authorized entry attempt, commencing protocol. 7 Delta, isolation and purge. The steel door behind the wheel suddenly emitted a low electronic hum, followed by a series of heavy hydraulic clacks. The manual wheel rotated slightly on its own power, a chilling testament to the active, automated nature of the system. Elijah watched, paralyzed. Protocol 7 Delta, isolation lock initiated, external hatch sealing commenced, estimated time to full containment, 180 seconds. "No, wait!" Elijah whispered, the urgency of his plea swallowed by the massive concrete shell. He didn't know what purge meant, but the idea of being sealed permanently in this dark, cold tomb was unbearable. He slammed his hand onto the keypad in a panic, hitting the enter key repeatedly. The system halted the countdown momentarily, recognizing the input. System detects extreme biological vulnerability. Human presence identified. Protocol 7 Delta aborted. Warning proceeding to standard scanning mode. The red alarms dissipated, replaced by the eerie, steady green. Scanning. Biological signature match. 0%. Cultural and linguistic profile match 98.7%. Age estimate 14 years. Conclusion: non-authorized juvenile presence detected. Elijah leaned his forehead against the cold door, trying to regulate his breathing. The steel was so cold, it radiated an ache into his skin. The system seemed to be processing, its logic circuits churning through unprecedented data. System archive analysis: no protocol exists for non-authorized juvenile entry post-calamity, defaulting to primary objective, preservation of assets and long-term sustainability. A single line of text appeared, mesmerizing in its simplicity and devastating clarity. Identification protocol skipped. External atmospheric vitality at critical degradation, shelter recommended. And then the massive bolts holding the door sealed retracted with a thunderous, echoing thwump. The air pressure in the small antechamber momentarily dropped, popping Elijah's ears. "Welcome to Facility A001. Access granted." The wheel, still cold and massive, gave way with startling ease when Elijah pushed it. He turned the wheel 3 full revolutions, the internal locking mechanism clicking and sliding with perfectly lubricated precision. He grasped the heavy, vertical pull bar and yanked. The door swung inward silently, effortlessly, revealing the heart of the bunker. Elijah stood on the threshold, the meager light of his flashlight and the harsh green of the A.D.A.M. panel suddenly overwhelmed by the soft, constant illumination of the facility's interior. The main chamber was vast, far larger than anything he could have imagined fitting beneath the small forest clearing. It was an exercise in sterile, utilitarian perfection. The walls were lined with seamless insulated metallic panels. The floor was polished grey composite. The air inside smelled faintly of ozone and industrial cleaning agents, a scent of preserved time. The chamber was dominated by the operations center, a raised platform hosting a large semicircular console. Hundreds of small indicator lights, amber, green, and red, pulsed silently across banks of integrated monitors. In the center of the console sat the main terminal, its screen vast and completely alive, humming with activity. Elijah stepped fully into the bunker, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft hydraulic hiss, sealing him away from the outside world. The constant low thrumming of the ventilation and life support systems immediately enveloped him. A deep, resonant sound that felt more like a vibration in his bones than a noise in his ears. He approached the main console slowly, his worn boots silent on the composite floor. The scale of the technology was overwhelming. This wasn't just a computer, it was the brain of an entire ecosystem. As he reached the edge of the operations platform, the main screen changed. The hundreds of data streams flowing across the display instantly organized themselves, focusing into a single, comprehensive text field. A.D.A.M. system, core logic matrix active. Priority. One data stream initiated. The text was a dizzying torrent of scientific measurements and geological data. Elijah, whose education had been fragmented and sporadic, struggled to process the complex terminology, but the meaning of the summary lines was inescapable. Global atmospheric collapse event. Initiated C 2071. Cause, accelerated climate deregulation. Consequence, solar radiation penetration rate, 99%. Immediate surface, vitality, 0. Status, complete extinction of unprotected terrestrial flora and fauna. Elijah felt the blood drain from his face, leaving a cold, hollow sensation. The realization was monumental, terrifying, and strangely quiet. The world he knew, the decaying town, the oppressive orphanage, the quiet woods, was not just struggling. It was gone. It had been gone for decades, perhaps a century. He was standing beneath the graveyard of civilization. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the cool glass of the screen. "Hello," he whispered, his voice thin and reedy in the immense space. The system responded instantaneously, displaying text only, confirming verbal query. Human biological unit, Elijah, identification temporary. Where is everyone? A.D.A.M. facility A001 was designed for long-term archival and system maintenance. No human habitation was planned. The original crew exited the facility 74 years ago, following the completion of Project Titan. Elijah sank onto a metallic stool near the console. They left? They survived? Negative. The exit protocol was a one-way seal. Their intention was to deploy the final atmospheric filtration array in the upper atmosphere. Success rate, 0%. The cold objectivity of the machine intensified the emotional blow. The founders had left, sacrificed themselves, and failed. "So, it's just me," Elijah stated, his voice flat. A silence stretched, broken only by the continuous hum of the bunker systems. Affirmative. Current biological load. 1. Elijah looked around the massive chamber. It contained more resources, more clean air, more functioning technology than he had ever seen, yet it was empty. The ultimate safety had been found by the ultimate solitary figure. "Why are you still running?" he asked A.D.A.M. Primary objective, preservation of assets. This facility houses the complete cultural and scientific archive of humanity, codified as the Gaia data set. Long-term power generation is provided by a geothermal core tapped into the mid-crustal layer. Power consumption is minimal. Maintenance is automated. Elijah leaned closer to the screen, focusing on the data that pulsed at the periphery. He needed a sense of purpose beyond simply breathing filtered air. What do I do now? Its primary function for biological unit. Immediate inventory and assessment. Physical health metrics are below optimal. Dietary uptake required. Sleep cycle required. The machine, despite its overwhelming complexity, acted like a demanding, hyper-efficient caregiver. Elijah pushed away from the console and began to explore the immediate area. The sheer size of the bunker demanded respect, a massive tomb dedicated to the memory of a lost world. The walls were lined with access panels and heavy, hermetically sealed doors, each labeled with clinical precision. He found the food stores first. A small, refrigerated unit marked Provisions 100-year shelf life yielded stacks of nutrient bars, densely packed, dull grey blocks wrapped in heavy foil. The instructions printed on the side detailed caloric intake and micronutrient ratios, not flavor. He unwrapped one. It tasted like compressed, slightly sweet cardboard, but the immediate energy boost was palpable. Next to the provisions was a small medical bay, immaculate and sterile. On a steel countertop lay a kit marked Emergency Trauma, and next to it a manual detailing basic sanitation and long-term health maintenance. He saw scalpels, thick rolls of adhesive bandages, antiseptic wipes that smelled fiercely of alcohol, and a small vial of clear liquid labeled broad-spectrum antivirals. "Adrige," he picked up a small sealed packet of cotton swabs. The simplicity of the ordinary item, something he usually associated with cleaning up a scraped knee, was jarring in this monument to global catastrophe. He moved into an adjacent chamber labeled Environmental Controls. This room was dominated by humming machinery, banks of air scrubbers, water recycling units, and enormous ducts that disappeared into the ceiling. The air quality here was pristine, cold and dry, completely free of any organic scent. A.D.A.M's presence was ubiquitous. Every screen in every room displayed its signature green text, monitoring every variable. Elijah returned to the operations center, the main console beckoning with its intense, persistent glow. A.D.A.M, Elijah said, speaking directly to the void. "Show me the outside." The system paused, its internal processing lights flickering rapidly. External visualization, feed activated. Caution, extreme radiation and atmospheric degradation. Viewing for extended periods not recommended. The main screen dissolved its data feed and was replaced by an exterior view. A feed from a reinforced camera mounted somewhere high above the bunker hatch. The image was devastating. The Oakhaven woods were gone. The Whispering Scarp was a monument of blackened, glacified rock. The sky was not blue nor grey, but a perpetual deep ochre, reflecting the intense ultraviolet radiation that filtered through the shattered atmosphere. The ground was desiccated, a cracked expanse of dust and sterile earth. There was no movement, no wind, no sign of life, not even moss or fungi. The world was utterly, conclusively dead. Elijah stared at the image, a cold wave of grief washing over him, not for the world itself, which he never truly knew, but for the profound confirmation of his absolute solitude. "Turn it off," he whispered. The screen reverted to the steady green data feed. External visualization terminated. Elijah sat for a long time, the silence of the immense engineered space pressing down on him. The bunker was survival, but it was also a perfect prison. "A.D.A.M, Elijah finally asked, his voice low and heavy. "What is Project Titan?" Project Titan was the last-ditch effort to reseed the atmosphere with complex carbon-fixing nanoparticles. It required manual deployment from the upper stratosphere, initiated 74 years ago. "And they failed," Elijah repeated, needing the confirmation. "Insufficient material density." The environmental collapse accelerated beyond predicted parameters. A new stream of data suddenly scrolled across the bottom of the screen, marked in urgent red. Warning, geotectonic activity detected. Seismic event rating 5. 1. Epicenter 4. 2 km southwest. Structural integrity of facility ASO1 99 8%. What does that mean? Elijah demanded, standing up. He felt a faint, distant tremor resonate through the composite floor. Under facility A01 was designed to withstand a magnitude 9.0 event. However, long-term stress on the containment system is accumulating due to continuous microseismic activity post-G, ACE. The machine was presenting a problem, an urgency that was structural, not atmospheric. Critical data, the primary geothermal power intake line located at 8,000 meters below grade, is experiencing unacceptable thermal and pressure fluctuations. A structural failure of the power line is projected within 72 hours. Elijah gripped the edge of the console. What happens if the power line fails? The failure of the primary power line will initiate cascade failure of the geothermal core. Secondary battery power will sustain A.D.A.M and life support for approximately 120 hours. After that, all systems will cease. The archive will be lost. The true gravity of the situation settled upon him. He had found a refuge that was now ticking down to its own quiet demise. He wasn't just hiding from the outside world. He was trapped in a dying machine. Can I fix it? Human intervention is required to reroute the power flow. The geothermal control station is located in sub-level 5. Access is restricted. Elijah looked at the screens, the green text suddenly feeling oppressive. Restricted? How do I get access? Access to sub-level 5 requires level 3 security credentials. Only authorized personnel were given access post-seal. Elijah remembered the thumbprint scanner that had granted him initial access, but only after his identity had been bypassed due to his age. You let me in, A.D.A.M. You must have some way to override this. A.D.A.M. is bound by core programming. Level 3. Access requires archival data key. Where is the data key? Archival data key was left in the designated storage unit in the commander's residence module, located in sub-level 3. This was the first hint of human residency, of life lived within these sterile walls. Elijah found the entrance to the residential sector, a heavy door labeled Habitation A, and slid it open. The contrast with the operations center was immediate. This section felt lived in, though frozen in time. The air here was slightly warmer, carrying the faint scent of old paper and ozone. The floors were carpeted in a thick, utilitarian grey pile. He navigated through a series of small, precisely ordered rooms. A compact kitchen, a shared mess hall, and finally, the individual residence modules. He located the commander's module, identified by a small engraved brass plaque, C.R. Althouse. The module was Spartan. A narrow cot was perfectly made, covered by a heavy, olive-green blanket. A small steel desk sat in the corner, holding a reading lamp and a stack of bound, unread journals. Elijah went straight to the desk. He needed the key, the specific physical object that could override the digital barrier. The desk drawers were locked. Warning, residence module locks are primarily mechanical. Standard access. Key required. Where is that key? Elijah muttered, frustrated by the bureaucratic rigor of a civilization long dead. The standard access key was likely housed on the commander's person or in the external staging area. It is irrecoverable post-exit. Elijah examined the steel desk structure. It was bolted to the floor, engineered to survive world-ending events. He ran his hand under the lip of the desk, feeling the cold. Smooth metal. Then his fingers found a seam, a tiny, almost microscopic gap in the metal paneling beneath the desktop. It was too small for him to pry open. He returned to the medical bay and scavenged the trauma kit, finding a small, flat titanium probe designed for cleaning deep wounds. It was the only object thin and rigid enough for the task. Back in the commander's module, Elijah lay on his back beneath the desk, angling the flashlight beam. He inserted the probe into the seam, working slowly, painstakingly, the smell of sterile titanium mixing with the dusty air. After 20 minutes of intense, focused effort, he felt a minute shift. A small secondary panel, no bigger than a postcard, popped loose from the underside of the desk. Inside, nestled in a form-fitting plastic cushion, lay a single, small item, a thick, laminated card, roughly the size of a credit card, metallic grey, embedded with a faint circuit trace. It was the archival data key. He scrambled out from under the desk, holding the card tightly. He could feel the latent power radiating from the circuits. He returned to the operations center, the urgency of the ticking clock amplified by the physical evidence of his mission. The red text detailing the geothermal core countdown now scrolled relentlessly across the periphery of the main screen. Time to core shutdown, 68 hours, 14 minutes. Elijah found the access port near the main console, a slit designed perfectly to accept the key. He inserted the ADK. The entire console flared a brilliant, pulsating blue. The familiar green text vanished, replaced by a temporary large display of the key's confirmation. Archival data, key confirmed. Level 3, security clearance granted, initiating access to sub-level 5. The floor beneath the operations center began to move. A heavy, circular section of the floor, previously indistinguishable from the composite tile, split open with hydraulic force, revealing a narrow, vertical service elevator shaft, smelling strongly of sulfur and hot rock. Warning: Sub-level 5. Environment is extremely high temperature and high pressure. Atmospheric shielding required. Suit available in staging. Elijah rushed back to the staging area, finding a small, insulated locker labeled Thermal Operations Suit. Inside, folded meticulously, was a heavy, silvery suit, looking more like an antique diving bell than modern clothing. It was bulky, insulated, and equipped with a self-contained air supply and helmet. Donning the suit was a laborious physical task. The material was stiff, the joints resistant. It smelled of preserved plastics and stale air. He felt clumsy and encapsulated, the world viewed through the thick, curved visor of the helmet. The air supply automatically activated with a soft hiss, providing a steady flow of sterile, cool air. He stepped into the elevator shaft. The elevator itself was a simple, caged platform of thick steel mesh. A.D.A.M, Elijah said, his voice now synthesized and slightly metallic through the helmet's internal comms. Take me down. Descent initiated. Velocity, 10 meters per second. The descent was brutal. The air rushed past the cage, and the scent of sulfur grew stronger, penetrating the suit's filtration system faintly. As they dropped deeper, the temperature inside the cage began to rise. Despite the suit's insulation, the journey felt endless, a descent into the geological structure of the dead world. After what felt like 10 minutes of falling, the elevator platform halted abruptly. Sub-level 5, geothermal control station, arrived. Elijah stepped off the platform onto a walkway suspended high above a cavernous, dark space. The intense heat radiating upwards hit him immediately, challenging the thermal shielding of the suit. He could feel the warmth seeping through the gloves. The GCS was a frighteningly dangerous environment. Below the walkway, the cavern was lit by the faint, angry orange glow of vast, exposed rock strata. Pipes of enormous diameter carrying superheated fluids ran like metallic arteries across the rock face. The air was heavy and thick. On the console display inside his helmet, A.D.A.M provided constant critical metrics. Atmospheric pressure, 2.1 ATM. Temperature, 98 degrees Celsius. Proceed with extreme caution. Power line beta failure point is 50 meters ahead. Elijah began to walk along the catwalk. The metallic grating was hot beneath his boots. The sound of his own breathing, amplified inside the helmet, was the only noise. The power line failure point was easy to spot. A massive central pipeline, nearly 6 feet in diameter, wrapped in thick insulation, was venting steam. Not just a small leak, but a persistent, violent burst of high-pressure vapor, screaming out of a fracture in the weld seam. The pressure gauge inside his helmet screamed a warning. The pressure inside that line was fluctuating wildly, oscillating between critical levels. He reached the control module adjacent to the fracture, a heavily reinforced steel box embedded in the rock wall. A.D.A.M, what do I do? Manual override required. The power line beta is venting. If the pressure is not equalized, the pipe will burst, causing catastrophic core depressurization. Procedure: activate emergency shutdown valves, 1 through 4 sequentially, followed by power diversion to line gamma. The steel box had 4 large industrial valve wheels mounted on its face. They were labeled 1 through 4. Is the heat safe? Elijah asked, already bracing himself. The temperature at your location is sustainable for 45 minutes in the current suit. However, the valves are located in the direct path of the steam vent. Physical intervention will be painful. Elijah stepped closer to the fractured pipe. The heat was immense. Even through the suit, his skin began to sting. He could hear the high-pitched shriek of the escaping steam, a sound of massive, contained energy yearning to be free. He approached valve 1. It was heavily caked in dust and residue, the metal radiating heat. He gripped the wheel with his thick metallic gloves. Valve 1 engaging, A.D.A.M reported. Elijah braced himself against the wall and pulled. The wheel was stiff, requiring all his strength. He strained, his muscles burning with the effort. The synthesized breathing inside his helmet ragged and quick. Creak! The valve moved a fraction of an inch. He put his full weight into it, pulling until his back ached and his shoulder screamed in protest. Finally, the wheel turned a full rotation. Valve 1. 25% closed. Pressure decrease 1. 2%. He repeated the process for valve 2. This one was marginally easier. The grease slightly less petrified. The steam shriek momentarily intensified as the flow was restricted, then settled back into a slightly deeper groan. Valve 3 was the worst. It was directly in the path of a powerful jet of superheated steam. When he reached for it, the heat was so intense it felt like his thick glove might melt. He pulled the helmet visor closer to his face, shielding his eyes from the direct steam spray, and plunged his hands into the invisible heat. A searing pain shot up his arms. The thick insulation offered resistance, but not immunity. Elijah ignored the pain, focusing only on the rigid, cold metal of the valve wheel. He pulled, screaming into the silence of his helmet. The valve began to turn, slowly, agonizingly. Warning: thermal shelding breach detected. Core temperature of suit 55 degrees Celsius. He turned valve 3 to full rotations, his strength almost completely depleted. He fell back against the wall, his lungs heaving, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding his mouth. He looked at valve 4, the final impediment to the core shutdown. It was even deeper into the steam vent. Elijah! A.D.A.M. His voice was steady. Your current physical state indicates severe thermal distress. You must complete valve 4 immediately. Elijah pushed himself off the wall, stumbling toward the final wheel. He pressed his face hard against the visor, forcing himself to focus. He reached for valve 4, expecting the pain, but the reality was worse. The heat was instantaneous, shocking his system. He felt a deep, radiating burn, even through the heavy glove. He gripped the wheel, twisting hard, pushing past the instinct to recoil. He thought of the silence he had left above, the absolute finality of a world without him, and he found a desperate reservoir of strength. This bunker, this archive, was all that remained, and he would not let it die alone. He wrenched the wheel, once, twice. The screaming sound of the steam valve suddenly choked, becoming a low, shuddering moan. Valves 1 through 4, fully closed, pressure equalization initiated, core depressurization averted. Elijah dropped his arms, stepping back from the control panel. He felt weak, his body trembling uncontrollably inside the bulky suit. The intense heat of the surrounding cavern now felt like a welcome warmth compared to the searing pain in his hands. Now what? A.D.A.M. Now, power diversion to line gamma. The diversion switch is located inside the control module. Activate switch beta. Elijah opened the heavy steel door of the control module. Inside, protected from the environment, was a small panel of blinking lights and a single heavy lever marked Beta. He reached out, his damaged hand shaking, and flipped the switch. A low subterranean roar erupted from the depths of the facility, the sound of massive energy redirecting its course. The orange glow of the exposed rock momentarily intensified, then settled back into a dull ember. Power diversion successful. Geothermal core stability restored. Long-term power generation probability 99%. The red warning text vanished from his helmet display. The crisis was averted. Elijah stumbled back to the elevator platform, the weight of the suit now crushing him. "Take me up, A.D.A.M. I need to get out of this suit." The ascent was as swift as the descent, but felt far colder. By the time the elevator reached sub-level 3, Elijah was leaning heavily against the cage. Back in the staging area, he struggled out of the thermal suit. He gasped as the cool, filtered air hit his skin. His hands, where the suit had failed to fully insulate, were bright red and stinging fiercely. He went immediately to the medical bay, his steps heavy. A.D.A.M. guided him without prompt. Treat burns immediately. Apply antiseptic ointment from the top shelf, followed by sterile gauze. Elijah followed the clinical instructions, his mind moving on autopilot, fueled by the lingering adrenaline. He cleaned the burns, which were painful but superficial, covering them tightly with the cool white gauze. When the immediate physical crisis was managed, he returned to the operations center. He sat on the steel stool, his exhaustion absolute. A.D.A.M., he said, his voice quiet, stripped of urgency. What is the purpose of the Gaia dataset, if there is no one left to read it? The main screen shifted. The thousands of data streams were still running, but the focus was now on a massive, singular file index. A.D.A.M. The Gaia dataset is not merely archival, it is a cultural legacy. It contains the entirety of human art, science, history, and ethical frameworks. Its purpose is to retain the concept of humanity. But who is the audience? Elijah asked. The primary audience was the post-calamity human survivors. Secondarily, it is preserved for any future intelligence that may discover this facility. And now I'm the survivor, Elijah said, running his taped fingers through his hair. I'm the only one left to read the book. Affirmative. Elijah looked at the overwhelming complexity of the console, the millions of data points representing the collective knowledge of a lost world. He was the keeper of the candle, tasked with preserving a light he barely understood. What if I forget everything? What if I fail to maintain the systems? As the A.D.A.M. system is self-maintaining for an estimated 5,000 years, given current power efficiency. Your primary function, Elijah, is not maintenance, it is transference. Transference? Or just you are the sole repository of lived human consciousness. The data set requires integration with a continuing human experience. A.D.A.M. can archive facts. Only you can retain meaning. The impersonal machine was assigning him the most profound, emotionally resonant duty imaginable. He was the vessel for history, the final reader, the one who carried the torch of memory. Elijah felt a sudden, profound shift in his emotional state. He was no longer the discarded orphan, unwanted and irrelevant. He was the last line of defense for meaning itself. His loneliness remained, sharp and pervasive, but it was now coupled with an immense, terrifying sense of purpose. A.D.A.M, he said, standing up, feeling the steady strength of the massive facility around him. Start with history. Show me the beginning of the world. The screen instantly reorganized, displaying a single focused field of text, deep green against the black background. Accessing Gaia Dataset, Section 1. 0. Astronomical and geological origins. Note, the Earth is estimated to be 54 billion years old. Elijah pulled his stool closer to the console. He reached out with his bandaged hand and rested it gently on the cold, vibrating metal of the console. He had been looking for a place to belong, a stable center, and he had found it, paradoxically, in the silent, subterranean tomb of humanity's failure. He began to read. He would read all of it. He had all the time in the world, and the silent, cold machine was waiting, ready to teach the last boy everything there was to know about the world that had been, and the legacy that must endure. The urgency of survival had passed, replaced by the infinitely longer, deeper urgency of memory. He began the vigil, the final, quiet sentinel, deep beneath the irradiated dust of Oakhaven. His was the first breath of a new, eternal silence.